can see what kind of pattern the division of labor will take by considering opportunity cost. So let's imagine that we have two goods we can produce. We can produce iPhones and we can produce iPads. So we have iPhones that we can produce iPads. There are two countries, we'll say, that could produce these goods. You have Canada and the United States. And in Canada, let's suppose that it takes 3 hours of labor to produce an iPhone and 4 hours of labor to produce an iPad. Whereas in the United States, it only requires 2 hours of labor to produce an iPhone and 2 hours of labor to produce an iPad. Now here, it's important to note that we're talking about the amount of input that we need to get a given output. In this case, 3 hours of Canadian labor to produce an iPhone, or 2 hours of American labor to produce an iPhone, 4 hours of Canadian labor to produce an iPad, 2 hours of American labor to produce an iPad. Now then, often when you do a problem like this for an exam or for an assignment, you're going to be talking about the amount of output that you get given certain inputs. So the way that it might be framed here would be, say, 3 iPhones or 4 iPads in a day. In Canada, 2 iPhones or 2 iPads in a day. In the United States, that is manifestly not what's going on here. Again, we're talking about it requiring 3 hours to produce an iPhone in Canada, 4 hours to produce an iPad in Canada, or 2 hours to produce an iPhone or 2 hours to produce an iPad in the United States. Now then, in order to see the form that the division of labor is going to take, what we need to do is compare the opportunity costs of producing iPhones in Canada to the opportunity cost of producing iPhones in the United States. We need to compare the opportunity cost of producing an iPad in Canada to the opportunity cost of producing an iPad in the United States. So if it takes 3 hours to produce an iPhone in Canada, the question you need to ask is, well, how many iPads could I produce in those 3 hours? And if it requires 4 hours to produce an iPad, well, then you can get, in that 3 hours, 3/4 of an iPad. If it takes you 3 hours to produce an iPhone, 4 hours to produce an iPad, then in the 4 hours that you spend in Canada producing an iPad, you could produce 4/3 of an iPhone, or 1 1/3 iPhones. So you would give up the opportunity to produce 1 iPad and get the opportunity to produce 4/3 of an iPhone, or 1 1/3 iPhones. It's easier in the United States because we've got basically the same numbers here. So if we give up the 2 hours we could spend producing an iPhone and instead use it to produce an iPad, then we would get 1 iPad. If we were to give up the 2 hours we're going to spend producing an iPad and use it instead to produce an iPhone, we would get 1 iPhone. So every iPhone in the United States cost 1 iPad. Every iPad in the United States would cost 1 iPhone. Here we can think about what this tells us about comparative costs. So at first glance it looks, and to the untrained eye say, it appears that the United States should produce iPhones and iPads because it requires less labor to produce an iPhone, less labor to produce an iPad, no reason to trade with Canada, except for the fact that what matters is not the absolute input cost, but rather the comparative cost. In the United States, the opportunity cost of producing an iPhone is actually higher than it is in Canada. So the US is actually the high cost producer of iPhones because each iPhone costs Americans 1 iPad. Each iPhone only costs Canadians 3/4 of an iPad. Similarly, the United States is the low-cost producer of iPads because each iPad only costs Americans one iPhone, whereas each iPad costs Canadians 1 1/3 iPhones. So Canada should specialize in the production of iPhones because they have a cost advantage. They can produce iPhones at a lower opportunity cost than can Americans. Americans can produce iPads at a lower opportunity cost than can Canadians. Therefore, Americans should specialize in the production of iPads. Just a couple of minutes ago, we were able to compare costs by looking at the amount of input that's required to produce a given output. Now, let's take a given amount of input and see how much output we can produce given that, and then use that information to compare costs. So we have two countries, Canada and the United States, that can produce iPhones or iPads. In a 24-hour period, suppose that Canadians could produce 8 iPhones or 6 iPads. Americans, on the other hand, could produce 12 iPhones or 12 iPads. So if it takes, say, 3 hours to produce an iPhone in Canada, then in a 24-hour period, Canadians could produce 8 iPhones. If it takes 4 hours to produce an iPad, then in a 24-hour period, Canadians could produce 6 iPads. For Americans, if it takes 2 hours to produce an iPhone and 2 hours to produce an iPad, then they can produce either 12 iPhones or 12 iPads. Now we want to figure out opportunity cost. We want to figure out how much it costs to produce an iPhone in Canada, how much it costs to produce an iPad in Canada, how much it costs to produce an iPhone or an iPad in the United States. And in order to do this, we take what we give up, we compare it to what we get. We take what we give up, we compare it to what we get. So, in Canada, if we decided to devote an entire day to producing iPhones, we would get 8 iPhones. We give up the opportunity to produce 6 iPads. So we give up 6 iPads to get 8 iPhones. The opportunity cost of each iPhone is 3/4 of an iPad. Similarly, we give up the opportunity to produce 8 iPhones in order to produce 6 iPads. The opportunity cost of each iPad, 4/3 of an iPhone, or 1 1/3 iPhones. In the United States, we could give up the opportunity to produce 12 iPads to get 12 iPhones. So each iPhone costs us 1 iPad. Or we could give up the opportunity to produce 12 iPhones in order to get 12 iPads. Each iPad costs us 1 iPhone. Once again, we can compare costs to see how the division of labor will emerge. Canadians are the low-cost producers of iPhones and will therefore specialize in iPhones. Americans are the low-cost producers of iPads and will therefore specialize in iPads. So what's important to remember when you're doing a problem like this is to ask, what kind of information do I have? Am I dealing with the amount of input to produce a given amount of output? Or am I dealing with a given input and then being told how much output I can produce using that? Fundamentally, in order to explore the division of labor and to see how that will emerge or how it will change, you need to know that what you're comparing is what you give up to what you get. That then is going to give you opportunity costs. That then is going to help you identify the low-cost producer of a good or service, and then that's going to allow you to make some predictions about how the division of labor is going to proceed.